on March 17, 1982, as the hills of the Ozark in Missouri began to thaw, revealing the harsh truths of a long winter. A social services assistant named Margaret Wilson made her way to an isolated cabin in Shannon County. What she encountered there would permanently reshape her understanding of extreme social isolation and the consequences of institutional neglect throughout America's rural communities. The Shelton property stood 27 kilometers removed from the nearest town, Current River. A dirt road, often impassable during the spring rains, provided the only access. For over 30 years, the family had lived with virtually no connection to the outside world. Margaret's visit came in response to an anonymous complaint received by the Missouri Department of Social Services, alleging that children were living in unhealthy conditions and possibly suffering from abuse. Upon arrival, Elijah Shelton, a 47-year-old man of medium build with a graying beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold the weight of generations lived in isolation, greeted Margaret. He shared the cabin with his sister Martha, 43, and 3 children: Thomas, age 12, Sadie, age 9, and little Jacob, only 5 years old. The cabin, constructed by Elijah's grandfather during the 1920s, stood as a simple wooden structure containing 2 bedrooms, a kitchen area, and a living space. The property included a modest barn, a vegetable garden, and a well. There was no electricity or running water. Their isolation was nearly complete, with only occasional trips to town for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. The day was mild, with temperatures reaching 17 degrees Celsius and partly cloudy skies. Recent thawing had left the ground surrounding the cabin muddy, and the air carried that distinctive smell of damp earth and decaying wood. During her initial inspection, Margaret observed that the children displayed signs of mild malnutrition and had clearly lacked basic medical care. Thomas bore a poorly healed scar on his right arm from an axe accident the previous year. Sadie had a slight strabismus that had never received treatment. Jacob, the youngest, showed indications of cognitive developmental delay for his age. What particularly caught Margaret's attention, however, were the striking physical similarities between the children and the 2 adults. They all shared the same intense blue eyes, the same facial bone configuration, the same ear shape, characteristics suggesting not merely kinship but also very close consanguinity. When Margaret inquired about the children's mother, Elijah hesitated momentarily before explaining that his wife had died during Jacob's delivery. Martha remained silent throughout, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the social worker. It was at this moment that Margaret began to suspect something didn't add up. County records showed no marriage certificate for Elijah Shelton. In fact, the only documents she could locate were the birth certificates of Elijah and Martha, children of Harold and Edith Shelton, along with a land ownership record dating from 1924. The children had no official birth certificates. The Shelton family had gradually retreated into deeper isolation following the death of Elijah and Martha's parents in a 1973 fire. Since then, the siblings had severed nearly every connection with the local community, visiting town only for essential supplies. Current River residents described Elijah as reserved and suspicious, a man who avoided prolonged interactions with others. The first suspicions that Martha might actually be the biological mother of the children began forming in Margaret's mind as she observed the family dynamics. The way Jacob instinctively clung to Martha's skirts, how intuitively she seemed to know each child's needs, and how her gaze revealed a maternal bond extending far beyond that of an aunt. A formal investigation into the Shelton case commenced on March 24, 1982, 1 week after Margaret Wilson's initial visit. The Missouri Department of Social Services, working alongside the Shannon County Sheriff's Office, sent a team to evaluate the situation. The group included Margaret, police officer David Tanner, and pediatrician Dr. Robert Hayes. The team's first obstacle came in the form of Elijah's resistance. When confronted with more direct questions about the children's origins, he became defensive, insisting that authorities had no right to interfere with his family's life. "Would take care of our own," he kept repeating, a phrase that would later reveal deeply disturbing implications. Martha remained mostly silent throughout, responding only with monosyllables when directly questioned. The children demonstrated a mixture of curiosity and fear toward the visitors, revealing their limited contact with anyone outside their family unit. Dr. Hayes conducted basic physical examinations and observed several concerning signs. Beyond mild malnutrition and absence of preventive medical care, he noted physical characteristics potentially indicating genetic problems consistent with endogamy. Thomas had polydactyly, an extra finger on his left hand. Sadie showed dental development issues, and Jacob displayed more severe cognitive impairment than initially apparent. These signs, observed individually, could have various explanations. Dr. Hayes noted in his report, but observed together, combined with the shared physical characteristics and family isolation, they raise serious concerns about possible consanguinity. The investigation gained momentum when the team accessed the family's sparse medical records. In 1970, Martha had received treatment at a neighboring county hospital following a domestic accident. The attending physician had noted she was 3 months pregnant. However, no birth or adoption record for any child from that period existed. Deeper searching revealed a pattern. Martha had been treated at different regional hospitals in 1970, 1973, and 1977, years corresponding approximately to the ages of Thomas, Sadie, and Jacob. On each occasion, she used different names, but basic physical descriptions and medical data indicated the same person. The investigation hit a significant obstacle when Elijah, sensing the direction of events, prohibited investigators from entering the property. Legally, without concrete evidence of abuse or severe neglect, authorities had limited intervention options available. It was at this crucial moment that a key witness emerged. Sarah Jenkins, an 83-year-old woman living about 5 kilometers from the Shelton property, contacted Margaret after hearing rumors about the investigation. Sarah revealed she had been a friend of Edith, Elijah and Martha's mother, and had maintained sporadic contact with the family, even after their isolation began. Edith always feared something like this might happen, Sarah shared. Harold kept the family isolated, insisting the world was corrupt and they could only trust their own blood. After they died in that fire, I tried to help the children, but Elijah was already so much like his father. Suspicious, hostile. Sarah disclosed that she had visited the cabin several times after the parents' death, bringing supplies and offering assistance. During one such visit in 1971, she noticed Martha was visibly pregnant. When she questioned Elijah about it, he expelled her from the property and forbade her return. "I should have done something then," Sarah lamented. "But who would have believed me? And where would those children have ended up? The system doesn't take good care of our people around here." Sarah's testimony provided important context, but not definitive proof. The investigation needed concrete evidence to justify intervention. A breakthrough occurred when one investigator reviewed Elijah and Martha's birth records and discovered something intriguing. Their parents, Harold and Edith Shelton, had shared the same surname before marriage. Further research revealed they had been first cousins. This wasn't uncommon in such isolated communities, explained a local historian consulted by the team. During the early 20th century, many mountain families lived so remotely that marriages between close relatives happened simply because there were no other options. In some cases, this practice became almost a family tradition, justified by beliefs about blood purity. This discovery cast new light on the case. It wasn't just a potential incestuous relationship between Elijah and Martha, but possibly a generational pattern of endogamy intensifying across successive generations. The team developed a new theory. Elijah and Martha's parents, already cousins themselves, had transmitted isolationist beliefs to their children. After the parents died, the siblings, already socially isolated and possibly influenced by distorted ideas about family and purity, established an incestuous relationship resulting in 3 children. The investigation encountered a distraction when a local resident claimed to have seen a different woman on the Shelton property during the early 1970s. This information briefly suggested a third person might be involved, perhaps an Elijah wife who later disappeared. However, subsequent inquiries revealed the witness had likely confused either the property or the date. Sheriff John Pearson, regarding the allegations, began considering obtaining a court order for DNA samples from both children and adults. However, the legal process promised to be complicated, especially given the family's isolation and lack of conclusive evidence of abuse or neglect that would justify such invasive intervention. "One need to proceed carefully here," the sheriff argued. "These people have lived this way for generations. To them, this is normal. If we invade their property without concrete evidence, we might lose any chance of helping these children." The investigation reached an impasse lasting several months. During this period, the Department of Social Services maintained regular property visits, monitoring the children's well-being, while gradually attempting to build trust with the family. The Shelton case's real turning point came in September 1982, 6 months after the investigation began. During one of her routine property visits, Margaret Wilson noticed Jacob, the youngest child, had developed a high fever and showed signs of severe respiratory infection. Despite Elijah's initial resistance, she convinced him to allow the child to be taken to West Plains Hospital, the largest nearby city. At the hospital, Dr. Michael Brennan, a genetic specialist already consulted on the case, took the opportunity to conduct more thorough examinations with Elijah's reluctant consent as he accompanied his son. Jacob's test results revealed multiple subtle congenital anomalies that individually might have gone unnoticed, but together formed a consistent pattern indicating a high degree of consanguinity. The genetic markers we're observing here, Dr. Brennan explained to the investigation team, are typical of children born from first-degree relative relationships. There's excessive homozygosity, far more than you'd see even with first-cousin parents. During Jacob's 2-week hospitalization for pneumonia complications, Martha remained constantly at his side, demonstrating strikingly maternal care and visible anxiety. It was during this period that Martha, physically and emotionally exhausted, finally began opening up to Margaret. One night, while Jacob slept under medication, Martha shared fragments of her story. She spoke about the growing isolation after her parents' death, how Elijah gradually assumed the family patriarch role, and how the boundaries between family roles began blurring. "We didn't know anyone else," Martha confessed in an almost inaudible whisper. "Elijah said the outside world wanted to separate us, hurt us. He said we could only trust each other." Although Martha didn't explicitly admit to being the children's biological mother, during this conversation, her words and emotions made the situation increasingly clear to Margaret. The social worker, exercising extreme care not to shatter the fragile trust being established, avoided direct questions about paternity, focusing instead on offering emotional support. Meanwhile, documentary investigation continued progressing. A significant advancement occurred when researchers located a traveling pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, who had visited isolated Ozark mountain communities during the 1960s and 1970s. Reverend Miller had maintained detailed daily journals, including observations about the families he encountered. In an entry dated June 1969, he described visiting the Shelton property. "I visited the Shelton family today. Their parents recently died under tragic circumstances, leaving 2 adult children. Elijah, 34, and Martha, 30. I found them living in extreme poverty and isolation. I offered spiritual and material assistance, but was received with suspicion, especially by young Elijah. Something in the dynamic between the siblings seemed disturbing. Martha appeared submissive, almost fearful. I fear that without their parents' moderating influence, isolationist though they were, the situation may deteriorate. I intend to return, but confess I felt quite powerless." A later entry from April 1971 proved even more revealing. "I returned to the Shelton property after nearly 2 years. Elijah prevented me from entering, appearing even more hostile and paranoid than before. From a distance, I glimpsed Martha briefly. She seemed in an advanced state of pregnancy. When I mentioned this to Elijah, suggesting they might need medical attention, he became furious, accusing me of spreading lies and threatening assault if I didn't leave immediately. I reported my concerns to the local sheriff, but they said without concrete evidence of abuse, nothing could be done. These mountains keep their secrets, and I fear some are too dark to withstand daylight." Reverend Miller's diary provided the first contemporary evidence of Martha's pregnancy, corroborating the investigation's suspicions. Another crucial development occurred when authorities located medical records from a Springfield hospital where Martha had been treated in 1977 under the name Mary Smith. The records confirmed she had been hospitalized in active labor and had given birth to a boy with multiple health complications, including breathing difficulties and a minor cardiac defect. The birth date coincided with Jacob's approximate age. The medical team at that time had noted concerns about possible genetic abnormalities and recommended further testing, but Mary Smith left the hospital against medical advice as soon as her condition and the babies stabilized. While Jacob recovered at the hospital, Dr. Brennan, with limited judicial authorization, conducted additional examinations revealing that the boy had a rare genetic condition called Apert syndrome, characterized by skull, face, hand, and foot malformations. This syndrome can occur spontaneously, but its incidence increases significantly in cases of close consanguinity. Based on this new evidence, Judge Eleanor Simmons issued a warrant authorizing DNA testing for all Shelton children and adults. The results obtained in November 1982 proved conclusive Elijah was the biological father and Martha the biological mother of all 3 children. On December 7, 1982, based on the genetic evidence and collected testimonies, Elijah Shelton was formally charged with incest, a Class D felony in Missouri, punishable by up to 4 years imprisonment. Martha, considered a victim due to evidence of prolonged psychological coercion, faced no criminal charges, though her capacity to care for the children was questioned in court. Elijah Shelton's trial began in February 1983 and attracted significant regional media attention, despite efforts to keep the case relatively discreet and protect the children's privacy. The Shannon County Courthouse hosted one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in its history. During the trial, Elijah's defense, led by Public Defender Gerald Thompson, argued that extreme isolation and the dysfunctional environment in which he had been raised had compromised his ability to discern basic social and moral norms. Thompson presented evidence that Harold and Edith Shelton, Elijah and Martha's parents, had deliberately isolated their children, depriving them of formal education and normal social contact. The defendant, Thompson argued, is the product of generational isolation and possibly previous endogamy. He himself is the child of first cousins who raised him to believe the outside world was hostile and that family should remain inwardly focused. The prosecution, represented by Amanda Lewis, acknowledged the mitigating circumstances, but maintained that Elijah understood the nature of his actions. The defendant demonstrated ability to interact with the community when necessary, to conduct basic business, and deliberately hide the true nature of his relationship with his sister. Lewis argued, "These are not the actions of someone unable to distinguish right from wrong." Martha Shelton testified behind closed doors. Edited excerpts from her testimony, later released, revealed a pattern of psychological manipulation beginning after her parents' death, when she was 29 and Elijah 33. According to Martha, Elijah gradually assumed complete control over all aspects of her life, increasingly isolating her and convincing her that the outside world threatened their safety and family unity. "He told us we were special," Martha testified, "that our blood was pure, that our children would be strong because they wouldn't be contaminated by the outside world. At first I resisted, but after years alone with him, I started to believe." Dr. Richard Foster, a psychiatrist specializing in social isolation dynamics and dysfunctional family systems, testified as an expert witness, explaining to the jury the profound effects of extreme isolation and prolonged indoctrination. "What we see here is a classic case of an alternative reality constructed through isolation," Dr. Foster explained. "When someone is systematically excluded from all normative social references, their perception of what's acceptable can become radically distorted." The trial also highlighted local institutions' failure to identify and intervene in the situation. Evidence revealed that at least 3 different people had expressed concerns over the year's Reverend Miller, neighbor Sarah Jenkins, and an employee at the current River Supply store who had noticed similarities between the children and adults occasionally visiting the store. In none of these instances had authorities properly followed up, revealing systemic failures in monitoring isolated communities and protecting vulnerable people in remote rural areas. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury found Elijah Shelton guilty of incest, but recommended leniency due to mitigating circumstances. Judge Eleanor Simmons sentenced him to 3 years imprisonment with possibility of parole after 18 months, and ordered compulsory psychological treatment. In her final statement, Judge Simmons observed, "This case represents a collective failure, not just of the defendant, who remains responsible for his actions, but of a society that allows entire families to fall outside our protection and support systems. Geographical isolation should not mean institutional abandonment." Regarding the children, the court ordered them to remain temporarily in state custody, while Martha received intensive psychological treatment. The ultimate goal was family reunification, provided Martha demonstrated capacity to properly care for the children while maintaining their integration into the broader community. The children were placed with a foster family in a neighboring county, where they began receiving formal education and medical treatment for their various conditions. Thomas, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptability, quickly catching up to his peers academically. Despite her initial delays, Sadie experienced more difficulty with social adaptation, but responded well to treatment for her strabismus and other health issues. Jacob, the youngest and most severely affected by genetic disorders, underwent several surgeries to correct malformations and began intensive intervention for his developmental delays. Comprehensive genetic testing revealed that all 3 children carried multiple genetic anomalies resulting from endogamy. Thomas primarily presented minor issues such as polydactyly, already surgically corrected, and a predisposition to certain autoimmune diseases. Sadie faced more significant problems, including a rare enzymatic deficiency affecting her metabolism that required continuous medication. Jacob, as previously identified, suffered from Apert syndrome among other complications, requiring lifelong medical care. The Shelton case prompted significant changes in service policies throughout Missouri and neighboring states. The Shelton Law, approved by the State Legislative Assembly in 1985, established more rigorous protocols for monitoring families in isolated areas, including regular social worker visits and wellness checks for all children, regardless of formal complaints. Elijah Shelton served 22 months of his sentence before being released on parole in 1985. As conditions of his release, he was prohibited from returning to the family property, while children remained under Martha's care and was required to undergo continuous therapy and regular supervision. Martha, after 2 years of intensive treatment, regained custody of the children in 1984. With state assistance, she moved to a small house on the outskirts of West Plains, where the children could continue their education and medical treatment. She completed her GED, earned a high school equivalency diploma, and eventually found work as a library assistant at a local library. The Shelton family's story continued evolving over subsequent decades. Thomas, the eldest son, overcame the adversities of his upbringing and graduated in social work, dedicating his career to helping vulnerable children in similar situations. Sadie faced more difficulties, struggling with chronic health issues and psychological challenges related to her past, but eventually found stability as an artist and craftsperson. Jacob, despite his physical and cognitive limitations, achieved semi-independent living with community support and became an advocate for disabled persons' rights in rural areas. The Shelton case remains an iconic study in social work and law schools nationwide, illustrating the complex intersections between geographic isolation, rural poverty, dysfunctional family dynamics, and institutional failures. It also highlights the physical and psychological effects of endogamy, not just on directly affected children, but across subsequent generations. In 2002, 20 years after the initial discovery, Margaret Wilson, then retired, reflected on the case in a local newspaper interview. Looking back, what's most striking is how something so extreme could happen practically in plain sight. This wasn't some cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was less than 30 kilometers from a town, in a country with resources and institutions supposedly capable of protecting the vulnerable. It makes you wonder how many other similar cases exist, hidden in remote valleys or right in front of us, waiting for someone to pay attention. The original Shelton property, abandoned for years, was eventually sold by the state in 1990. The cabin has since collapsed, but the land remains a silent reminder of how extreme isolation can distort realities and perpetuate cycles of damage across generations. If you've made it this far, it's because cases that leave lasting marks on families matter to you. Leave a comment saying, "I made it this far," so we know who truly cares about pursuing the truth. Don't forget to like this video and share it with others who value understanding human nature's complexities and the importance of effective protection systems. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now to follow more investigations of cases that prompt reflection on our society and collective responsibility.